Every civilization believes its systems are temporary, that they emerged from circumstance, that they can be amended, corrected, or dismantled when they no longer serve their purpose. History suggests otherwise. The most enduring systems are not those built for flexibility, but those built for continuity. They do not announce themselves as traps, they present as solutions, and once adopted, they quietly redefine what becomes possible. The modern financial order is one such system. It is often described as complex, technical, or abstract. But at its core, it rests on a single unsettling premise: obligation without resolution. Debt that does not aim to end. This is not a metaphor. It is structure. Across the world, every advanced economy carries a burden that grows faster than its capacity to resolve it. Not occasionally, not during crisis, continuously. And this raises a question that polite discourse avoids. Why would any rational system be designed in such a way? To answer this, one must step back from contemporary politics and return to first principles. Debt, for most of history, was finite. It arose from necessity: war, famine, construction, expansion, and it carried consequence. Those who borrowed too much lost credibility. Those who lent too freely accepted risk. Defaults occurred. They were disruptive, humiliating, and often violent, but they cleared the ledger. This clearing was essential. It allowed societies to reset, renegotiate, and reconstitute authority. Endless debt was not considered stability. It was considered decay. The transformation occurred when debt ceased to be a personal obligation and became an institutional one, when repayment was replaced with perpetuation. This did not happen through ideology, it happened through exhaustion. Late 17th century Europe was trapped in near constant conflict. Wars had grown too large, too expensive, too frequent. Traditional methods of finance, royal loans, emergency taxation, confiscation, were no longer sufficient. States required a mechanism that could fund war without collapsing legitimacy. The solution was elegant. Rather than borrowing money to be repaid, states would borrow money to be serviced. Interest would be paid indefinitely. The principal would remain untouched. In exchange, creditors received something unprecedented: predictability. Predictability backed not by a monarch's promise, but by the machinery of the state itself: taxation, administration, continuity. This was the birth of permanent public debt. It was not secretive. It was debated, legislated, documented, and it worked. Governments could now raise enormous sums rapidly. Creditors enjoyed steady, low-risk returns. Markets gained a new, reliable asset, but something profound changed. Debt ceased to be a problem to solve. It became a condition to maintain. Once this logic was established, it spread rapidly. Other states adopted similar arrangements. Debt instruments became tradable. Markets deepened. Institutions formed around them. What began as wartime expedients hardened into orthodoxy. By the time the modern era arrived, the idea that public debt should be eliminated seemed not only unrealistic, but dangerous. Why? Because debt had become the foundation of money itself. When obligations are monetized, repayment destroys liquidity. To pay down debt is to remove currency from circulation. Thus, elimination becomes contraction, and contraction threatens stability. This is the paradox at the heart of modern finance. The system requires debt to function, which means it cannot tolerate its disappearance. As financial markets matured, another evolution occurred. Debt ceased to be local. it became transnational. Obligations were no longer held by a single creditor, but dispersed across networks of institutions. Banks, funds, pensions, insurance structures. This dispersion made default unthinkable. A default no longer punished a lender. It destabilized an ecosystem. Thus, debt became too interconnected to fail. And once something becomes indispensable, it becomes untouchable. The 20th century completed this transformation. Central banking institutionalized the system. Money creation was separated from physical constraint and tied instead to policy. Debt issuance no longer required corresponding reserves. It required confidence. Confidence that obligations would be honored. Confidence that institutions would endure. Confidence that continuity would be preserved. This removed the final limit. Debt could now expand without immediate consequence, not because it was harmless, but because consequences could be deferred into the future, deferred across populations, deferred into abstraction. The burden did not disappear. It was redistributed temporally onto those not yet born. This is not a moral argument. It is an architectural one. Every generation inherits a system already in motion. They do not choose its foundation. They adapt to its momentum, and over time, adaptation becomes dependence. Dependence becomes normality. Normality becomes invisibility. This is how systems become inescapable without appearing oppressive. They do not restrain movement. They define the boundaries of thought. When people ask whether the debt will ever be repaid, they are asking the wrong question. The correct question is whether repayment was ever intended. The answer, historically, is no. The intention was continuity. To fund power without rupture. To sustain authority without interruption. To ensure that obligation never reaches closure. This design has consequences. Not immediate collapse, but gradual constraint. As interest absorbs more resources, flexibility diminishes. Choices narrow. Future policy becomes pre-committed. The present lives increasingly on borrowed time. This is where we now stand. Inside a system that functions precisely because it cannot end. In the next part, we will examine how this structure operates in contemporary life. Who holds the obligations? Who benefits from their permanence? And why attempts to fix the system often reinforce it instead? To understand why this system persists, one must look not at its rhetoric, but at its mechanics. Modern public debt does not behave as a burden. It behaves as infrastructure. This distinction is rarely articulated, yet it explains nearly every apparent contradiction. Infrastructure is not designed to be eliminated. It is designed to be maintained. Roads are repaired, not abolished. Institutions are reformed, not dismantled. And debt, once it becomes structural, is managed, not resolved. The obligations that define modern economies are no longer incidental liabilities. They are instruments. They perform specific functions within the financial order. They absorb surplus capital. They provide stability to portfolios. They anchor expectations of return. Most importantly, they serve as the reference point against which all other risk is measured. This is why public debt occupies a privileged position. It is treated as the safest asset, not because it is free of danger, but because it is foundational. Remove it, and the entire hierarchy of valuation collapses. This reality produces a peculiar inversion. The greater the quantity of debt, the more indispensable it becomes. As obligations expand, they bind more institutions to their survival. Pension systems rely on them for predictability. Insurance structures rely on them for solvency. Banks rely on them for regulatory compliance. Thus, debt is not merely tolerated, it is demanded. Attempts to reduce it encounter resistance not from ideology, but from dependence. This dependence is often misunderstood as irresponsibility. In truth, it is constraint. Once a system is built upon continuous obligation, withdrawal becomes destabilizing, and destabilization is politically unacceptable. This is why discussions of fiscal discipline rarely move beyond rhetoric. Austerity is discussed. Sacrifice is invoked, but structural reduction remains elusive. Because reduction threatens pillars that now support livelihoods, security, and legitimacy. Another misconception concerns ownership. Public discourse often frames debt as something owed abroad. This creates the illusion of external vulnerability. In reality, the majority of obligations circulate internally. They are held by domestic institutions, retirement schemes, and central authorities. This internalization transforms debt from a geopolitical liability into a domestic balancing mechanism. Money flows outward through interest, but stability flows inward through obligation. The system feeds itself. Central banking completes this circuit. By acting as both regulator and participant, monetary authorities stabilize demand for public debt. When markets hesitate, they intervene. When liquidity tightens, they expand. This role is not conspiratorial. It is explicit, but it carries consequence. Once a central authority commits to supporting obligations indefinitely, the market's disciplining function weakens. Borrowing becomes easier. Risk becomes abstract. Limits blur. This does not cause immediate failure. It causes gradual saturation. Debt expands not because of recklessness, but because restraint has been removed. The cost of this removal is deferred. Deferred through inflation. Deferred through currency adjustment. Deferred through time. Inflation is particularly misunderstood. It is often framed as a policy error. Historically, it functions as a method of reconciliation. When obligations exceed capacity, value adjusts. Prices rise. Purchasing power erodes. Debts shrink in real terms. This process is never announced as strategy. It emerges as outcome. Those who hold currency bear the cost. Those who hold assets are insulated. This asymmetry is not accidental. It is structural. The philosopher David Hume observed that monetary systems ultimately rely on trust rather than substance. When trust must be preserved, appearances are managed carefully. Stability is performed. Markets open, payments are made, rituals continue. Continuity becomes reassurance. Reassurance maintains confidence. Confidence sustains the system. This is why collapse rarely arrives suddenly. It arrives as adjustment. Interest rates rise, growth slows. Standards recalibrate. Life continues. But the margin for choice narrows. As obligations accumulate, future decisions become constrained by past commitments. Policy becomes reactive rather than creative. Innovation gives way to maintenance. This is the quiet cost of permanence. A system designed never to end must continually borrow from the future. The future, in turn, inherits limitation rather than possibility. This is the tension modern societies live with. Not catastrophe, constraint. The system functions, but with diminishing freedom. This is why reform efforts so often disappoint. They address symptoms rather than architecture. They promise relief without disruption. But architecture resists cosmetic change. To alter it would require confronting dependency directly. And dependency is rarely surrendered voluntarily. In the next part, we will examine how this structure shapes perception itself, how narratives are formed, how dissent is softened, how intelligent individuals sense enclosure without perceiving its walls. Because the most effective systems do not merely organize resources, they organize belief. A structure of this magnitude cannot endure by force alone. It endures through perception, more precisely, through the management of expectation. The modern system of obligation survives not because it is loved, but because it is assumed. Assumption is its greatest defense. Most individuals do not consciously endorse permanent debt. They simply grow up inside it. From an early age, the language of obligation becomes normalized. Credit is framed as opportunity, borrowing as participation, leverage as intelligence. Debt is no longer introduced as burden, but as access. Access to education, access to housing, access to mobility. This reframing is subtle, yet decisive. When obligation is associated with advancement, resistance appears regressive. Those who question it seem nostalgic, impractical, or naive. Thus, dissent is culturally disarmed. Another mechanism operates alongside this linguistic shift: temporal distancing. The consequences of debt are rarely immediate. They unfold gradually across decades. Interest compounds quietly. Commitments accumulate invisibly. Flexibility erodes incrementally. Human psychology struggles with delayed consequence. What is not felt is not feared. What is not feared is not challenged. This creates a gap between intuition and action. People sense unease, but lack urgency. This unease manifests as vague dissatisfaction rather than focused critique. Media discourse reinforces this condition. Coverage tends to concentrate on surface movement. Rates rise, markets fall, budgets expand. These are presented as episodes, rarely as expressions of underlying design. The narrative resets with each cycle. Context dissolves. Without continuity of explanation, pattern recognition fails. And without pattern recognition, structural critique never matures. Expert commentary further narrows the frame. Analysis is offered within accepted parameters. Debt is discussed in terms of sustainability, not legitimacy. Adjustment, not transformation. Management, not resolution. The boundaries of discourse remain intact. Within those boundaries, debate appears vibrant. Outside them, silence prevails. This is not censorship, it is convention. Convention shapes what is considered reasonable. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein noted that the limits of language are the limits of thought. When structural alternatives lack vocabulary, they lack credibility. This is compounded by moral displacement. Responsibility is diffused across institutions. Central authorities set policy. Governments approve budgets. Markets respond. No single actor appears accountable. Accountability dissolves into process. Process, once abstracted, loses moral weight. This abstraction is comforting. It allows individuals to participate without confronting consequence. They work, save, invest, and retire within a system whose logic they did not design. Questioning that logic feels both daunting and destabilizing. Better to adapt than to challenge. Fear plays a role here, but not the fear of collapse. Rather, the fear of instability. Instability threatens routine. Routine sustains identity. When stability is framed as fragile, people tolerate structures they distrust. They accept constraint in exchange for predictability. This is how permanence is defended emotionally. Another factor is prestige. Institutions associated with the system carry authority. Their language is formal. Their rituals are solemn. Their continuity is reassuring. Longevity is mistaken for legitimacy. Yet endurance alone does not imply virtue. It implies adaptation. The system adapts by absorbing critique without altering foundation. Calls for reform are redirected into technical debate. Rates are adjusted, rules refined, thresholds redefined. The core premise remains untouched. Obligation without resolution. This produces a peculiar psychological state. A population that feels constrained, yet cannot name the constraint. That suspects design, yet is told it is inevitability. That experiences pressure, yet is offered management rather than meaning. This state is not explosive. It is numbing. Numbness stabilizes systems more effectively than repression. People cease to expect alternatives. They learn to optimize within boundaries. This is how participation replaces consent. And participation, once habitual, sustains structure. The system does not require belief. It requires routine. Routine dulls inquiry. Inquiry threatens permanence. Thus, attention is guided elsewhere, toward cultural conflict, toward personal success, toward transient crises. Meanwhile, the architecture remains silent, persistent, unresolved. In the final part, we will confront what remains when illusion is stripped away. What responsibility means when escape is unrealistic. What agency looks like when systems are larger than individuals. And how dignity survives within structures designed to outlast generations. When the architecture is finally understood, a certain illusion dissolves. Not the illusion of collapse, but the illusion of rescue. Systems designed for permanence are not meant to be escaped. They are meant to be inhabited. This recognition alters the nature of responsibility. For centuries, political imagination has been shaped by rupture, revolution, overthrow, rebirth. These narratives flatter the ego. They imply decisive moments, heroic acts, and moral clarity. But enduring systems rarely end this way. They persist. They absorb shock. They reconfigure pressure. They survive their critics. To expect dramatic collapse is to misunderstand their purpose. They are not brittle. They are adaptive. The more accurate question is therefore not how to destroy such a system, but how to live within it without surrendering discernment. This is an older question than modern finance. It is philosophical. The Stoics understood that most structures governing human life lie beyond individual control. Empire, law, fortune. What mattered was not sovereignty over circumstance, but sovereignty over response. Agency was internal before it was political. This distinction is easily lost in an age obsessed with scale. Yet it remains essential. When obligation is permanent, freedom becomes qualitative rather than absolute. It is expressed not in escape, but in orientation. Understanding replaces denial. Preparation replaces surprise. Clarity replaces resentment. Those who comprehend the system cease to waste energy on fantasies of its sudden disappearance. Instead, they cultivate resilience. They limit exposure. They preserve optionality. They value liquidity not merely as capital, but as time. They avoid dependency disguised as convenience. They resist narratives that confuse leverage with intelligence. This is not withdrawal from society. It is composure within it. History offers quiet examples. Periods of prolonged obligation have always produced two responses. The first is excess participation. Individuals overextend, assuming continuity will protect them. They mistake stability for guarantee. When adjustment arrives, as it always does, they are exposed. The second response is restraint. Not asceticism, but proportion. Those who understand that permanence implies gradual cost learn to measure ambition carefully. They prioritize durability over acceleration. This difference compounds over generations. It produces continuity rather than spectacle. In elite cultures of the past, restraint was not moralism. It was intelligence. The future was treated as a responsibility, not an abstraction. One did not assume conditions would improve. One prepared for fluctuation. This mindset is unfashionable today. Optimism is marketed as virtue, yet optimism untempered by structure becomes fragility. The system exploits fragility. It thrives on overconfidence. It rewards participation that ignores asymmetry. Thus, the most subversive act is not protest, but comprehension. To see the architecture clearly. To understand that debt is not a failure of policy, but a feature of design. That permanence demands payment even when the invoice is delayed. This understanding produces a certain calm, a refusal to panic, a refusal to be seduced by promises of painless reform, a refusal to confuse motion with progress. It also restores dignity. Dignity arises when one acts without illusion, when one participates knowingly rather than compulsively, when one accepts limits without internalizing inferiority. The system does not require belief. It requires compliance. Belief is optional, and in that space, between compliance and belief, autonomy survives, not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently. This is where the intelligent individual operates, not as a savior, not as a victim, but as a steward of attention, time, and obligation. The system will continue. It was designed to. What changes is who understands it and who does not. And understanding, quietly accumulated, becomes its own form of power. If this reflection has sharpened something you already sensed, do not dismiss it as discomfort. Discomfort is often the mind recognizing structure before language catches up. If you found value here, consider marking it, not as endorsement, but as acknowledgement. Algorithms respond to signals, much like systems respond to participation. A measured gesture helps this work reach those who are prepared for it. And if there is one person in your life with whom such conversations feel rare but necessary, share this with them. Not to persuade, but to think together. Finally, if you choose to leave a comment, let it be deliberate, not reaction, but reflection. Thoughtful exchanges are the quiet currency of serious minds, and they honor the time invested in examining what most prefer not to see. Understanding does not liberate us from structure. It liberates us from surprise. And that, in an enduring system, is no small advantage.